Welcome into episode 89 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
There are parts of our computing and technology lives that are so standard, so ubiquitous that we don't even think about them being in our homes, our offices, everywhere we go. And that's how they get you. Have you ever really thought about your router? Follow-up question. Really? We have so many connected devices, it's possible that a lot of us don't even really know what a router does. We just know that we need one to do all the things that we want to do online, all the time, all at once. Today we're covering a few router basics as well as some serious threats to this ever-present bit of technology. Items on today's list: what does a router do exactly? What's going on with the Russians? What can you do to protect your system? And finally, we've got some router recommendations, not going over brands and models, but things for which to watch when you go out to get a router of your own, or replace the one you've got, or just know about the router you have. But let's start at the very beginning. What is it that a router actually does anyway?
Well, if you're listening to this podcast, you most likely have at least one computing device. In fact, it's highly likely that you have quite a few. But you most likely only have one connection to the internet at home, in the form of a cable or DSL modem. So how is it that all of your devices could be surfing the web at the same time? How is that single modem able to handle simultaneous requests from all of your different devices and know which device to send the data to? The capability to handle data to and from multiple devices comes in the form of a router. Now, a router does exactly what it sounds like. It routes network traffic, ensuring that the correct data gets to the correct device. So if you're surfing the web on your Mac and you go to visit apple.com, and at the same time your roommate goes to visit microsoft.com on their PC, your router makes sure the correct site loads on each of your computers. Now, at this point you might be thinking, hey, I don't have a router, I only have a modem. Well, these days most modems come with a router built right in. You actually might have more than one router in your house, especially if you have poor Wi-Fi reception and you need a Wi-Fi extender to ensure that you can access the internet from any room in your house. And routers don't just handle traffic to and from the internet. They also handle local traffic, such as sharing files between two computers on your home network. Depending on your age and your interest in video games, the phrase LAN party might send you into a bit of a nostalgia trip. I fondly remember getting together with a bunch of my friends and hauling heavy computer equipment over to one of our houses so we could play Unreal Tournament all night long. And by the way, Facing Worlds is still the best multiplayer map ever. Some people won't have any idea what I'm talking about.
I don't have any idea what you're talking about.
Oh, Ken, you missed some golden times in the late 90s.
I guess I must have.
Oh, Counter-Strike. That was my favorite one growing up.
Yeah, you see, fun story. I moved to San Francisco and I could legally drink. So the late 90s for me weren't LAN parties. They were parties. All right. So, what's weird to me is I know a tiny bit, basically because of a sponsor on another show. I know a tiny bit about mesh networks and things like that. It's weird to me, though, because I haven't really thought much about routers specifically. And one of the reasons that we're talking about this today is because there is actually a security threat today tied to routers. What's going on with the Russians?
Well, on April 18, 2018, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and FBI and the UK's National Cyber Security Centre jointly issued a technical alert in which they warned that hackers working on behalf of the Russian government were attacking a wide range of networking devices. The hacks were multi-stage, with the first step involving identification of internet-accessible network ports that could be used as an initial point of attack. Once a vulnerable device was identified, the hackers would send specially crafted malicious network traffic to the devices, which would in turn send back their configuration files. Those configuration files contained sensitive data, including hashed passwords for the network devices. The hackers would then crack the hash passwords and use the login credentials to access the devices remotely. At this point, they would effectively take over the router and use it to map internal network architectures, modify device firmware, perform man-in-the-middle attacks by redirecting network traffic through their own malicious servers, and use the compromised routers as the launching point for future attacks. By successfully taking over and controlling the router, the hackers had complete control over all subsequent network traffic passing through the router. This allowed them to steal user login credentials, intellectual property, and similar sensitive information. These attacks didn't leverage any new or novel zero-day exploits. Instead, they relied on the fact that most routers are running old, out of date, and thus vulnerable firmware because people rarely think to check and install security updates on their routers. In the cases of some routers, it's not even possible to install security updates, as the manufacturers have since gone out of business or stopped supporting that particular hardware model altogether.
Now, do we know whose routers they were targeting? I mean, are they going after, business or government, or is this like... I know we talked a few weeks ago about, people just trawl the web basically looking for weakness. I mean, were they just sort of sounding for as many weaknesses as they could find, or were they targeting specific institutions?
It sounds like it was more focused on businesses, small office, home office type situations, corporations. I mean, it was kind of across the board, but it did appear that they were looking for, kind of the intellectual property type stuff, the stuff that could actually be worth quite a bit. But it was, again, what you said, scanning the internet for vulnerabilities. We've talked before about, I believe, showed in the essentially the Google of vulnerabilities. There's all sorts of things in place. I mean, anybody with a computer could technically scan the internet for vulnerabilities. You probably make enough noise that your ISP would get a little upset and tell you knock it off. But, anybody who's connected to the network can also be checking for this stuff. So in this case, it sounds like they were doing it on a really large scale.
Let me go one question further. When you say making enough noise that your ISP might say knock it off, is your ISP going to see what you're doing and say, hey, knock it off? Or are they going to see, wow, this person's using a lot of data, knock it off?
More what you're doing, depending on... sometimes when, for example, when I've been searching for malware type stuff, sometimes searching for like a string I found in a malware file that I'm looking into, and I'll search on Google to see if anything else comes up, because sometimes you can kind of find your way down the rabbit hole that way. Well, in the past, there've been a few times where if I do enough searches of like code snippets on Google, that Google tells me to try my search again in a few minutes because it thinks it's automated malicious traffic. So that's just an example with Google. But your ISP, your ISP technically sees all the traffic that's coming out of your network. They're the ones who then handle routing your traffic from your modem to the internet. So they act as kind of a big router for your router. It's like Inception. But so, yeah, I mean, depending on the way their own network security systems are set up, if they would see a bunch of abnormal traffic, and it kind of depends. I mean, you have situations like botnets that can run and the ISPs don't seem to do anything about them. But I think it would also be depending on whether or not they'd get a complaint from somebody that you're attempting to get into other systems, something like that. So depending on the situation.
Sorry to get us off track, because I mean that's very much about what you're doing to go out with your router, and what we were talking about were vulnerabilities coming in. What can we do to protect the systems that we have?
Well, the answer to this one is it depends. It depends on a number of factors, such as, did you get your router from your internet service provider? Again, they usually come in the form of a cable or DSL modem combined with a router in a single piece of hardware. Did you provide your own router? Because some ISPs allow you to purchase a third-party modem router combo to use. Have you owned the same router for years and years and years? Do you even have access to your router? Or do you just have building-wide Wi-Fi? Like, that's common in college dorms or hotels, sometimes seen in apartments and condos. So if your router was provided by your ISP, or if you have building-wide Wi-Fi, it's up to the ISP or whoever's in charge of the building-wide Wi-Fi to ensure that the router remains patched and up to date. Now, most larger ISPs are pretty good about this, and the patches are installed automatically by their systems. You don't have to touch anything. In fact, they usually don't want you touching anything because they've got it set up the way they want it. Now, if you brought your own router, you'll need to log into it and check for firmware updates. Typically, this is done by joining the network for the router, either via Wi-Fi or by plugging directly into it with an Ethernet cable. Then accessing the router's configuration page by opening a web browser and typing the router's IP address into the URL bar. You might also need a password to log into the router, which is usually found on a sticker on the side of the physical device itself.
No, I removed mine.
Okay, I think ours is still here.
Except I may have forgot the password now, and now I have to hold down that little button.
I was going to say that there's the problem. So there are a few things to note when it comes to updating your router. It generally involves installing a firmware patch, which can brick your device if you goof it up. Usually, the router manufacturer includes a pretty quick and easy way to install updates and patches directly from the web page interface. But that's one of those things to be careful with, the word of warning. Even if you are able to access the configuration page for your router, you might not actually be able to check for or install updates. Again, usually the case where the router is supplied by your ISP and they don't want you messing with the settings. Now, in order to connect to the router in the first place, you're going to need the router's IP address. If you're connected via Wi-Fi on your Mac, it's really easy to find this. You hold down the Option key on your keyboard, and then you click the airport menu bar icon. And extra information will be displayed in the airport menu, including the router address for the network that you're connected to. So that's real simple. If you're connected via Ethernet, it's a little more complex. You would follow these steps. You would click the Apple menu in the upper left-hand corner on your Mac screen, and then click System Preferences. On the System Preferences screen, you'd click Network. And after making sure that your connection to the router is the one that is selected in the list of connections on the left-hand side of the network screen, there's an Advanced button in the lower right that you click. And finally, click the TCP IP tab on the screen that appears, and then you should see an IP address listed for the router.
And if you didn't get all that, don't worry, because we will have it up on the website for this episode of the show, and I'll remind you where that is a bit later.
On an iOS device, if you don't have access to a Mac on the network, you would tap the Settings app, and then tap Wi-Fi, and then tap the Info icon, which looks like a lowercase letter I inside a circle. Tap that next to your network. There should be your network name listed on the Wi-Fi screen. And then another screen will appear that shows more information, including the router address. So again, once you've found that IP address and you go to your web browser and enter that in the URL bar when you're connected to that router network, it will bring up the router's configuration page. And from there, you should be able to check for and install firmware updates, if any are available. Now, if there aren't any firmware updates available, and the last one was installed a really long time ago, you might want to check with the manufacturer and see if support has been discontinued for that particular model of router.
When you talk about the years and years thing, I know that, as far as I know, I can't think of the last time my cable company called me and said, "Hey, it's been a while. Would you like a new router? Do you need a new router? How's everything going with your router?" I mean, is it the kind of thing where you should actually, if your router is being supplied by your ISP, would it behoove you to call your cable company or call whoever it is that supplies your internet service and say, "Do I need a new one? Do you guys have one that's more up to date?" Yeah,
there are a couple things. The first and easiest would be if you log into your router's configuration page, even if it's from the ISP, and you can see the firmware version. You can usually Google the firmware version number in combination with the router model number, and which is usually listed on the router itself or on that configuration page, and that should give you an idea of when the firmware was released. And if it's in the past, 6 months. Even a year, maybe, probably 6 months, you're good. It shows that it's still being updated. However, if it's something that's showing that it was released 5 years ago, or if you've had the same, I had the same router. This was a long time ago, so I was at my old apartment, and I called up AT&T to see about switching to one of the faster tiers of bandwidth. And they actually were like, oh, your router's like 5 years old. It was something insane. Maybe it wasn't quite 5 years, but it was like 3 or 4 years old. And they actually had to issue a new physical device, and they made me pay for it and all that other fun stuff. And so in that case, yeah, I happen to have a really old router, and it wasn't even capable of connecting at higher bandwidth and wasn't getting updates. And no, they didn't bother telling me till I looked to upgrade service. They had no reason to.
That's a really good point right there. I mean, you had that one for a couple of years then, and people are upgrading their computer, their hardware a lot more recently. So you want to make sure that your router, your wireless, all your devices that you're using are going to take advantage of the latest technology that you bought in your new Mac laptop or your latest iPhone or whatever it is. So you could use that higher connection speed for whatever GNK-LMNOP version of your Wi-Fi that you just bought.
Yeah, that's very true. If you're transferring files between computers on your local network and you're running a really, really old Wi-Fi router, you could probably be getting and your devices are newer, you could be getting a lot faster speeds between them. It might be your network, your router that's limiting your transfer speeds there between devices on your internal network.
Now, I know we're not going to go through a catalog of brand names and model numbers, but let's say you find yourself, looking for a new router. What sort of things should you consider when you're considering a new one?
As we stated earlier, there's a good chance you won't have a choice when it comes to the main router supplied by your ISP. But if you are supplying your own router or have access to the router configuration, there are some things you could do to maximize your network security. First, you want to make sure that the router you purchased is a more recent model. Older routers are less likely to receive continued support from the manufacturer in the form of firmware updates and security patches, and depending on the age of the router, it might not even support the latest wireless security protocols. Now, if your router only supports the old WEP Wi-Fi security protocol, you're in for a bad time, as the protocol is vulnerable to attack, and the bad guys or your neighbors or some random person sitting in a car across the street could get access to your network pretty easily. Same goes for the original version of WPA protocol, WPA PSK TKIP. You'll want to be using WPA2 PSK AES. Some devices do offer a mixed mode option called WPA/WPA2 PSK TKIP AES, which offers compatibility if you have really old devices that need network access. But you really don't want to be connecting to the internet with ancient, insecure hardware anyway, so try to stay away from this. You'll want to make sure to turn off non-essential services and close down unused network ports, usually found in the firewall section of the router configuration page. And make sure that none of your computers are in the router's DMZ, which puts them outside of the protection of the firewall and essentially leaves them open to any and all traffic coming in and from the internet at large. If you're looking to add Wi-Fi extenders or create a mesh network so you can access the internet from down in the basement or up in the attic, make sure to check for compatibility between the modem router supplied by your ISP and the Wi-Fi extender that you're looking to get. Some routers can work in bridge mode, where any extender added to the network will just act as an extension of the main router. Other times, you might be able to connect the extenders to the Wi-Fi network supplied by the main router, but then have to connect to them as separate Wi-Fi networks depending on where you and the extenders are located in the house. So it basically comes down to doing a bit of research to ensure compatibility with your existing system, and whenever possible, going with the recent release hardware model from a reputable company. One final thing to note, while some routers come with a randomized password to access the system configuration, usually printed on the sticker that you'll find on the side of the router itself, there are many routers that come from reputable companies that still come with default usernames and passwords. And we're being serious. Some of them really are username and password or admin and password. So be sure to change the default login password if it's something silly like that to something more secure right away.
Do they do that because they actually think people are going to change it? Or do they do that because it's really just easier?
It's easier, and then they're like, be sure to change this right away, and nobody ever does.
Yeah, he's too busy trying to get online. Please, I got to go places so that people can steal my information from me.
The best story of that was there were some webcams a while ago where it automatically would connect your webcam to the cloud, give you like access when you're away or whatever, and they do that would be turned on by default, and it would have default username and password.
Yeah. That's
and like they ended up having to tell users. It was like in the middle of this piece of paper that was like, by the way, you should change the password right away because otherwise everybody in the world's gonna be able to see out of your webcam. And it's, in the middle of the book they provide with it.
Was it one of those like little 2-inch by 3-inch with the font that's about 5 point and then
Yep,
folds out like 8 pages, and right in the middle of that some places has that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good times. I feel certain that all of those cameras are very secure today. Hey, did you get all those router notifications things, by the way, the recommendations, the WPA 2A EIO? That's about what it sounded like to me. I mentioned earlier that we do have a web page for these things because there are a couple of checklists here that we just went over in this checklist, and you may want to make a checklist of your own. So head to our website, SecureMac.com/checklist. You'll look for notes for episode 89 if you want those router recommendations, or if you want those steps that Mr. Toczek was talking about earlier. And, of course, there's tons of other notes for tons of other shows that we've done all the way back to episode 1. SecureMac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you next week.